So thanks very much, everybody, for coming and joining us this evening for the fourth in our Jubilee Talks. This evening, we have Bob Morris from University College London's Constitution Unit talking about modern monarchy. After national service and a history degree from Christ's College, Cambridge, Dr. Bob Morris joined civil service, serving in the Home Office for nearly 40 years. His work spanned the normal departmental duties of immigration, prisons, policing, and public control and protection, but he was also involved in legislation and state litigation, acting as private secretary for Home Secretaries and as secretary to the public inquiries in Northern Ireland and on the UK prison service. Since his retirement, he's acted as a locum secretary for public affairs to the Archbishop of Canterbury and was secretary to the Heard Inquiry into the See of Canterbury and the role of the Archbishop. Bob is an honorary research fellow at UCL's Constitution Unit, where, although he's pursued a variety of interests, is most recently concentrated on ecclesiastical and royal issues. The author of numerous books and articles, his volume, The Role of Monarchy in Modern Democracy, co-edited with Professor Robert Hazel, was published in September 2020. And no doubt brings us on to this evening's topic, modern monarchy. Thank you very much, Bob. I will stop screen sharing and I'll hand over to you.
Right, well, warm good evening to everyone. It's a particular pleasure to be asked to give a talk for people living in one of the bonniest parts of the UK, which my wife and my wife was schooled in Belfast, and I last visited just a few years ago. I much enjoyed the previous talks, and I hope I can reach the same standard. Well, what can possibly modern people might ask about monarchy? Isn't it just an accidental survivor of former times? What could be more ridiculous than relying on heredity for choosing one's head of state? When powerful empires like Imperial Germany, Austro-Hungary, and Russia have disappeared in the wake of the First World War, and others, Bulgaria, Greece, Italy, Romania, and Yugoslavia, disappeared after the Second, how come there are still monarchies clinging on in Belgium, Denmark, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Spain, Sweden, and of course the UK? Moreover, they are not just surviving, but they're also very popular, certainly more popular than politicians, and are amongst what are generally regarded as the freest, most democratic, and most stable countries in the world. This is the apparent paradox that struck Robert Hazel and I at the Constitution Unit when we first began to think about this subject. We found it was rarely discussed in academic circles. Largely, it seemed, because academics thought they should not waste time on monarchy because it was going to disappear anyway. Well, we're still waiting. With the help of colleagues we found in the 7 other monarchy countries, we first discussed the subject at a seminar and then edited their subsequent contributions together with contributions of our own in a book, The Role of Monarchy in Modern Democracy, European Monarchies Compared, published in September 2020. September 2020, you may remember, was the worst time ever in recent years to publish anything. Now to the meat of things. I propose to lay out first how in general the 8 monarchies shape up, and then move on to consider both how our monarchy and others have changed during the Queen's reign. And finally, I shall hazard some conclusions about whether they will be able to continue for the foreseeable future. Yes, I shall also mention at some point Princes Andrew and Harry. I don't plan to say anything about Camilla, but perhaps if you're interested, we can talk about that later. I shall also reveal at the end a great secret. Right. The 8 European monarchies fall into 3 main groups. The ancient monarchies of Scandinavia and the UK, that is Denmark, Norway, and Sweden and ourselves. Secondly, the post-Napoleonic monarchies of the Netherlands, 1814, Belgium, 1830-31, and the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg, which became fully independent only in 1890. And thirdly and lastly, the restored monarchy of a united Spain, dating originally, of course, from 1492. Of these, only the UK remains an international monarchy, where the Queen is head of state in 14 other countries, as well as the UK. The UK is also the only monarchy that still has a coronation. The Danes stopped from 1848, the Swedes from 1875, and the Norwegians from 1905. The Belgians, the Dutch, the Luxembourgers, and to our surprise, the monarchy of a united Spain have never had coronations. It's possible that some of the precursor monarchies in Spain in the medieval period had coronations, but certainly that of the United Spain has never had so. The heir in Belgium doesn't become the sovereign until he or she swears the requisite constitutional oath in Parliament, and all the monarchs swear oaths at some point, usually in the parliaments, after accession. Although Denmark remained an absolutism between 1660 and 1848, and the pace of constitutional change varied between the countries, all are now fully democratic states. With the exception residually of Norway and Luxembourg, no monarch is now actively involved in the choice and appointment of the head of the executive, that is, the Prime Minister. With the exception of Spain, all the other monarchies now have gender-blind rules of succession. There are also important differences of scale in the size of the populations, which have consequences to which I shall return later. The UK at 67 million people is the largest by a long way. Spain, so recently restored, has a currently declining population of 47 million. The Netherlands is next with a population of just over 17 million. The Scandinavian countries are much smaller. Sweden has a little over 10 million, Denmark just under, and Norway just over 5 million. Luxembourg is the smallest of all at 630,000 people. There are also religious differences, which, though they don't explain whether coronations occur, may go some way to explaining why abdications are commoner in countries where a religious affiliation is compulsory. In the UK and the Scandinavian countries, the monarch has to be a member of the National Protestant Church. No other country's constitution has such explicit constitutional provisions, even in Spain. As a matter of practice, however, in Belgium and Spain, the monarchy is a Roman Catholic, and it would be inconceivable if they weren't. And in the Netherlands, the monarch is a Protestant. Except for the UK, all the other countries have written or codified constitutions. These in practice are documents of some generality that do not cover a great deal of detail, and moreover, and more importantly, do not always record actual constitutional practice. Thus, for example, a reading of the Danish constitution would suggest that the monarch is all-powerful, whereas in practice, all the significant powers are exercised by ministers. As a rueful George I observed after succeeding to the British throne from a little sandy kingdom in northern Germany in 1740, "In this country," he said, "it is ministers who are kings." With the exception of Japan, monarchy outside Europe generally has a very different character. The monarchies of Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states are much more like the absolutist regimes once common in Europe. In Malaysia, the monarchy actually rotates every 5 years between the Islamic former hereditary rulers of the states that constitute the federation. Although the Japanese emperor has traditional religious functions and has until recent times been the subject of religious reverence, he is otherwise constitutionally in the same position as the European constitutional monarchs. Well, why has monarchy survived? There is an important sense in which it has not survived. It is certainly not what it once was. No longer are kings, and it was usually men where the Salic law prevailed, were above the law. George I, for example, 20 years before he became king of Britain, and enraged by his wife's adultery with the handsome Swedish Count Königsmark, but overlooking his own adultery, of course, divorced her and imprisoned her until her death 30 years later, denying her access to her children or her father and forbidding her to remarry. It is also thought that he encompassed the murder of poor Count Königsmark, who just simply disappeared. It took something akin to a revolution in Denmark in 1848 to end the absolutist rule that then prevailed in Denmark. What at some distance we can now see as a process was one where monarchs surrendered political power and became impartial heads of state, accommodating themselves to developing democracy. In the UK, we can see Victoria's reign as epitomizing this journey. The franchise was expanded greatly, though not for women. They had to wait until 1928 to receive the universal right to vote. Never for one moment did Victoria contemplate dismissing, as her uncle William IV had done in 1834. He dismissed the whole cabinet because he didn't like its politics. Christian X did something like that in Denmark in 1920, but was very quickly persuaded to reverse his decision. In Sweden, on the other hand, from 1974, the monarchy became purely ceremonial, without, however, removing the king's ability to speak for the nation during a crisis, as at the time of the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, where nearly 500 Swedish citizens lost their lives. Not only did monarchs accommodate democracy, they actually helped, and still help, to legitimate it. Moreover, the retention of the principle of hereditary succession has the effect of denying access to the head of state role to anyone, including all politicians, not a member of the royal family. This means that the supreme constitutional office is beyond the reach of partisan politicians. Such processes continue. During her long reign, Elizabeth II has lost two powers: the power freely to choose the Prime Minister and the power to select the timing of the dissolution of Parliament as a precursor to a general election. Prime Ministers usually advised a date as to the dissolution, a date that they thought likely to be most favourable to their chances of re-election. And the choice is now under the control of Parliament itself, following the Fixed Term Parliament Act of 2011. The choice of Prime Minister remained only for so long as the Conservative Party, parliamentary party, did not have a process for electing their parliamentary leader, an absence remedied in the 1960s after, to many people's surprise, I think people of my own age may remember this very well, to our surprise, Alec Douglas Hume, a Scottish Earl in the House of Lords, of whom few people had heard, was appointed Prime Minister in 1963 in place of Harold Macmillan, who was retiring on health grounds. This was because it wasn't apparent that there was any other prominent leader who could carry the party with him. The Labour Party had always chosen its leader by election, and from 1924, it had become a settled convention that that leader would be chosen as the Prime Minister in the event of a Labour government. Well, telling a tale of survival is not, however, only about the politics of adjustment. Monarchies also found new or emphasized old roles. George III, the first Hanoverian king to have been born in Britain, is usually credited with beginning the development of a welfare and service model of monarchy. This is where the monarchy promoted philanthropic effort to address the well-being of the population outside the efforts of Parliament and executive government, which tended to be more focused on fiscal, defence and overseas issues than domestic needs. At the time, domestic issues were often regarded as the responsibility of the very limited and tightly resourced local government institutions of the day. The monarchy also became a more open and public affair. Royal marriages, for example, were not celebrated in public, but took place privately, often at night, in royal chapels. What we now take for granted as the current media simply did not exist, but its proliferation has had a marked impact on the presentation and visibility of the monarchy for Britain's rising population. The measure of the change can be illustrated from the facts that there were thought to be just over 5 million people in Great Britain in 1700, rising to the 67 million of today. In Ireland as a whole, of course, in 2016, the population in the Republic was 4.75 million, and in Northern Ireland 1.85, proportions which still remain, of course. One measure of royal service functions is the number of public engagements. A table is published every year in the Times, compiled by a private citizen. For 2021, this recorded in a COVID year that the 12 then active members of the royal family undertook nearly 3,000 engagements between them. The Queen, at the age of 95, completed nearly 200, Prince Charles 351, and his sister, the Princess Royal, topped everyone else again at 378. What is all this activity about? Some is formal, and these figures don't include engagements abroad. An important part of informal diplomacy, which as Seamus Farrell pointed out last week in the case of the Queen's 2011 Dublin visit, can have an enormous impact for our relations with our countries. An important role undertaken very successfully for the restored Spanish monarchy by Juan Carlos in the earlier, happier days of his reign. Our Queen's mantra is that she has to be seen to be believed, and that applies to all her family members and to the members of European royal families too. What in essence this activity does domestically is to draw attention to local endeavour and encourage local initiative. To put it more grandly, this is the monarchy supporting civil society, the grassroots of our social and political community, and reaching parts of our society that partisan politicians may not always be equipped to reach themselves. Prince Charles is on record of wanting to reduce the size of the active royal family. And it could be said, of course, that Princes Andrew and Harry, more about them later, have sought to anticipate his wishes. It is true that the size of active royal families elsewhere in Europe is much smaller than in our case. However, as the population numbers point out, they have smaller numbers to which to respond. Spain, on the other hand, is underweighted as well as less well-funded. There, the active royal family does not extend beyond the king, the queen, and their two daughters, both of whom are very young, though the elder is beginning as a teenager to take on public duties. In other monarchies, active members rarely go beyond the monarch and the heir with their spouses. While it is true that the King of Sweden in 2019 reduced the size of his royal family by removing 5 of his grandchildren from the succession, Prince Charles might want to weigh carefully the effects of further reduction in the size of the UK royal family if it is to continue the levels of support it can offer to public causes in its work of helping to nurture civil society. The accountability of monarchy. One of the criticisms of monarchy is that it's not accountable. That view might hold in the UK in the limited sense that it is not directly accountable to Parliament, though Parliament in fact votes money for its support and controls the rules of succession and the extent of its public roles. In fact, although hereditary, monarchy is accountable, just like any other public institution. The most high-profile example is King Juan Carlos of Spain, now in exile, and the subject still of prosecutorial investigations. But he is not alone. Other monarchs who stepped out of line have lost their thrones. The Grand Duchess Marie Adelaide of Luxembourg and King Leopold III of Belgium had to abdicate because of their conduct during the First, and in his case, the Second World Wars. In the UK, King Edward VIII was divorced and was forced by his government to abdicate because of his wish to marry a twice divorced woman, Wallis Simpson. When King Juan Carlos abdicated in 2014, he was not required by the Spanish government to do so, but opinion polls showed that 2/3 of Spaniards felt he should leave the throne. The recent misfortunes of Andrew remind us that only the sovereign is above the law. All other members of the royal family have no more immunity than everyone else. So what about the position of Princes Andrew and Harry? There's always been a difficulty in an hereditary system with princes and princesses who, though quite senior in the succession in early life, slip down the list as their siblings above them have children. Prince Andrew was third in line and is now 10th. Harry, once third, is now 6th. There was a similar difficulty with the younger sons of George III, who were a pretty rackety lot. Frederick, a previous Duke of York and the Commander-in-Chief of the Army, where he made many important reforms, resigned over a scandal in 1809. It was alleged that his then mistress, a perky lass, Maria Clark, had been selling army commissions and pocketing the proceeds. Because his direct knowledge of his mistress's activities were never proved, and his accuser was found to be complicit with the mistress, his brother, the regent, to some dismay at the time, restored Frederick to his post in 1811. The modern problem is that it seems insufficient effort and thought has been put into managing the career of younger princes, and too much reliance on giving them military careers alone. Although no longer credible heirs, they have stayed as part of the active royal family, and either scandal or self-exile has made it impossible for them to continue in such roles. It's difficult at present to see any likelihood that either prince will resume royal duties again. Is the conduct of the two princes likely to affect the continuing acceptability of the monarchy in the UK? It used to be said, for example, that, of George III's sons, that personal misconduct would not by itself threaten the institution of the monarchy. In present circumstances, that seems unlikely nowadays. Public dismay over the behavior of Juan Carlos was the direct cause of his abdication. And the fact that a son-in-law was sentenced to imprisonment for fraud damaged the Spanish monarchy's reputation. Events from which the present king has sought to distance the monarchy as far as possible. Although it seems unlikely that the Andrew and Harry affairs will cast a cloud over the Platinum celebrations because of the strong personal support for the Queen, they will certainly strengthen Prince Charles's resolve to reduce the size of the active royal family in order to decrease the possibility of bad behavior denting the monarchy's reputation. Perhaps the Queen's swift actions, first to make Andrew step back in 2019, and then in 21 to surrender his royal title and military honours. Perhaps those steps will emphasise Andrew's personal accountability and responsibility, limiting thereby adverse reflection on the monarchy. Coming towards the end now, is republicanism a threat? The recent decision by Barbados to remove the Queen as head of state and become a republic is a reminder that no constitutional system is necessarily going to last forever, or, least of all, has any automatic right to continue. As the Duke of Edinburgh observed in Canada in 1969, the royal family can only remain for so long as they are wanted. It is possible that others of the 14 remaining realms where the Queen is head of state may review their position following the Queen's death, just as Australia in its failed referendum of 1999. The Queen and her government's position has always been that it is a matter for the countries themselves alone to determine their future, and no doubt further changes can be expected. However, it is by no means straightforward to make such a change under some constitutions. Barbados, for example, did not need to hold a referendum, but others do. The Australian referendum failed principally because there was no agreement about how a president should be elected. Was it to be a parliamentary appointment or a popular vote? It is said of Pierre Trudeau, the father in the 60s of the present Canadian Prime Minister, it is said of him that when he came into office in the 1960s, he had been attracted by the notion of making Canada a republic. However, he then found it was very convenient that he was the appointing power for the Governor General, the local head of state, and his choice could ensure that the holder of that office would never be a political rival. Clearly, a republican form of government is entirely viable. The choice is between an executive presidency on the one hand, or impartial, more ceremonial head of state on the other. In recent decades, Ireland, for example, has had some noticeably successful presidencies, which have not followed earlier practice of appointing retired politicians, or indeed retiring them so that they become presidents. At this point, however, it may be useful to consider what a monarchy can bring to public life that a presidency can't. First, it brings a living family, which enables everyone to relate to someone of their own generation. One of my granddaughters was very disappointed at the age of 7 to realize she would be unable to marry her favorite prince. Presidents will rarely be in the prime of life, and their terms of office normally no longer last 10 years and usually less. The Platinum Jubilee reminds us that longevity has advantages. Secondly, monarchy can offer a more permanent focus for national life and embody the continuity and stability of public life. Its impartiality and dignity allows it to expect the recent its impartiality and dignity allows it to expect the best behavior from politicians. One of the features of the Supreme Court's recent decision to strike down an unlawful prorogation was to uphold probity in public political content and to not to abuse the position of the monarchy. In the case of executive presidencies like France and the US, no incumbent can get over the fact that a substantial minority probably didn't vote for them at all. The fact that they cannot be impartial in their conduct disqualifies them from assuming head of nation functions or undertaking the welfare and service roles open to monarchies. It is relevant that the Queen's COVID speech, which we may remember in May 2020, was much admired abroad. The French journalist Anne-Elisabeth Moutet, writing in the Telegraph, said, "In a country where, since the days of Charles de Gaulle, the president has simultaneously tried to symbolize the Republic and manage current affairs hand-on, the Queen's address has reminded everyone that there's a lot to be said for an uncontested head of state, completely detached from the fluctuations of day-to-day politics and from politicians' vagaries. Most of Emmanuel Macron's speeches, that is about the COVID have been too long in time, rarely less than 20 minutes, too long on posturing, we're war, repeated 6 times in an awkward televised speech, and too long on insincere technocratic babble. Finally, some last words. May I reveal that well-kept secret I promised at the beginning? It is, of course, that all the European monarchies and our own already possess almost all the characteristic of republics, except that we have hereditary presidents. The second president of the United States, John Adams, observed this of England in the 1770s. He said, the Constitution of England is in truth a republic, and has ever been so considered by foreigners and by the most learned and enlightened Englishmen. He went on, the British Constitution itself is republican, for I know of no better definition of a republic than this, that it is an empire of laws and not of men. So a final thought, could it be that if you start with a monarchy, a republic, what you get is what you get, whether you like it or not, if you can't keep hold of your monarchy in the first place? Happy to take questions or comments.
Thank you so much, Bob, for that. That was very, very interesting. I think I can already see some hands going up there. John O'Connor, did you want to come in? You'll need to unmute yourself there.
Yes, please. As regards the secret, I cannot regard the country as being Republican. Presidents don't have the secret powers that the monarch in the UK has, and don't have a Privy Council.
What secret powers do you have in mind?
Well, they as I understand it, and I would hope you will probably know more about it than I do, that they have the power to make legal laws, and for us to know nothing about it in the Privy Council.
Well, there's no secret about that. I mean, the proceedings of the Privy Council are published. You can view them. Orders in council are made there, yes. And that's it's a kind of subsidiary legislation, which doesn't need a parliamentary procedure. But there's nothing that the Queen does, which she does without the advice of ministers. The last time a monarch in Britain vetoed a bill was Queen Anne in 1708. And she vetoed it on the advice of ministers. It was a measure designed to establish a militia in Scotland, which you may remember in 1706, 1707, was united with England, and we became Great Britain. And the Scots hadn't got a militia at that time. But intelligence arrived suggesting that a large French fleet was sailing up the North Sea, and it was perhaps not a good idea to arm the Scots at that moment. So she vetoed the bill. But that is the last and most recent occasion on which it happened. And it illustrates the point that I would like to make, that the Queen has no significant power which she can exercise without the advice of ministers. She can't even decide what to call herself. The title of the Queen is settled in statute. I mean, these things may look differently. You know, I mean, the president, the presidents normally can rule by decree too, of course, which is a similar thing, perhaps.
Is there no power to secretly move funds?
No, not that I'm aware of. No. There have been changes in the way the monarchy is funded. Since the Act of 2013, a form of indexation has been introduced, but there are now no parliamentary annuities which Parliament pays to members of the royal family who are active. All that is undertaken by the Queen now from her own resources. The Duke of Edinburgh was the last person to have a parliamentary annuity. And that, of course, has died with him. So the Queen has taken on more of these expenses than was hitherto the case.
About that, I, of course, am an Irish Republican and don't apologize for that. But it seems to me remarkable that the people in England should support monarchy in the like of what Henry VIII did when he dissolved the monasteries. Now, and I'm not making a religious point on this. I'm making an economic point. He dissolved the monasteries, and the monasteries acted in a role something like the Ministry of Agriculture as advisors to agriculture and as sellers of seed and the like. And as I understand it, England had a 100-year famine after that.
Oh, I don't know about the famine, but we can all agree it was a long time ago.
Well, yes, it was, but it can happen. So why have a system where that can so easily happen?
But it was Parliament that decided to dissolve the monarchies. These were acts of Parliament. Now, in those days, Parliament was run by the Crown in a much more direct way, of course. But nonetheless, he did push the legislation through Parliament. And the acts which resulted in our break from Rome were acts of the English Parliament.
I say I don't want to focus on the religious aspect. I want to focus on the economic aspect and the fact that people starved as a result.
Well, I'm not sure that that's the case. One has to remember that a lot of the monarchies were insolvent. They were not in a position to do what they were there for. And monasteries had been dissolved before. I mean, individual houses had been closed when they got into difficulty. Henry V closed some monasteries, if I remember. However, as we were saying, it's rather a long time ago. And the monarchy has changed very considerably. And it has, as I was trying to say, some advantages.
Can I ask, Bob, does Parliament have the power then to remove a monarch?
The Parliament is supreme, yes, and it could do that if it wished to do so. And it got very close to that. I mean, it of course passed the act which ended Edward VIII's reign. Although it was the government that was responsible for conducting the negotiations with Edward VIII, which led to his abdication. It was also quite apparent, it had been quite apparent for some years that he was unlikely to be a satisfactory monarch. And you can imagine the maneuverings that took place as a result.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Peter, yes. You're muted there, Peter.
I'm sorry.
The Crown Estates,
Yes.
are they actually owned by the Crown or by Parliament?
Yes.
Can Parliament remove
Yes.
estates from the monarch?
Well, this was part of the deal done in 1760 when George III came to the throne. The idea had always been, since the 1690s, when the system was set up, that Parliament would vote a sum of money, and that would last the king for the whole of the duration of their reign, or queen, the whole duration of their reign. And this fell into some difficulty simply because of the movement of prices and inflation and so on and so forth in the 18th century. Meant that the sum of money voted by Parliament at the beginning of a reign became insufficient towards the end. And the Crown Estates had never been the personal property of the king. They were used to defray the costs of civil government. which in those days was fairly small. I mean, it was the judiciary and various other aspects of central government, which was then, of course, never as large as it has become since. And the deal was that he would surrender the Crown Estate's revenues, and Parliament would offer a larger sum to accommodate the Reign's needs. And the problem was, of course, that George III lasted a very long time indeed. He's second in the list behind the Queen, and Parliament had to revisit this from time to time. As Parliament had to do the same thing, of course, in the 1970s with the settlement that had been made originally with Elizabeth in 1952. And what we now have is a system where notionally on the basis of the revenue from the Crown Estates, which is a corporate body under an Act of Parliament managing the estates, and a proportion of their profit every year is allocated to the Queen's expenditure. It's been more or less doubled for the next few years because of the great expense of refurbishing Buckingham Palace, which has fallen into a bad state, may I say, having had to dodge some masonry on one occasion. that's probably set them up. It's the Treasury always opposed indexation, because indexation, of course, doesn't encourage economy. But that's the system that, nonetheless, the Chancellor of the day has now introduced. But the Crown Estate was never the personal property of the King in the sense that he could do with it as he wished.
Thank you. Any other questions there?
Can I offer a brief word about Camilla?
You are still being recorded, Bob.
Yeah. There's some uncertainty about whether she will be Queen. And if you remember, it was said at the time of her marriage to the Prince of Wales that she wouldn't be called Queen, she'd be called the Princess Consort. In law, there's no doubt that she would be the Queen, whether she likes it or not. How she styled herself, however, is another matter. Just as she calls herself the Duchess of Cornwall nowadays, rather than the Princess of Wales. And it's understood that Charles would like her to become Queen and be called Queen. And we shall have to see how that pans out. But I'm sure he will need to have a very careful discussion with the Prime Minister before a decision is made on that. Queens take part in the coronation, of course, for the King, and they are also anointed, not as lavishly as the King, but anointed in the coronation ceremony. No doubt that will be something in people's minds when the decision is approached. But perhaps I can ask you a question. Do you feel that the animus against Camilla is now much reduced? And people will be perfectly prepared to see her called Queen.
I think that Camilla probably will be called Queen because the behaviour of some of the royals since has diminished the animus towards her a great deal.
Yes. I think that's very likely.
Bob, can I ask two questions off the back of that? One is, you're talking about coronation, and to the uninitiated, and especially, I suppose, to younger generations who have never seen a coronation, it is the act where the monarch gets the crown put on their head, and that then makes them the monarch. Obviously, I'm missing something there, because you've already said that lots of monarchies don't have a coronation. So can you go into exactly what's involved and why other countries don't have them?
Well, I don't know why the other countries don't have them. I try to find out. And I think it's broadly that they thought that having coronations was probably incompatible with the kind of democratic states they'd become. whereas here the coronation has always had a considerable significance. But the coronation does not make a king. The king becomes the king immediately on the death of his predecessor. That is the common law rule. And whereas the Anglo-Norman kings in the 11th, 12th century used to date their regnal years from the date of their coronation, which was pretty damn quick after they succeeded, the kings from the 13th century onwards, the Anglican kings, dated it from the day that they succeeded. And the coronation itself followed on somewhat later. In the case of Edward I, he was abroad in Palestine, and it took him 2 years to get back. So he was quite keen on keeping the regnal year from his succession, of course. And if you remember, the last coronation took 16 months after the Queen was actually succeeded. I think Prince Charles would like to have the coronation rather more speedily. And I don't think it'll be quite the sort of lavish last imperial hurrah that it was in 1953. So what does the coronation do? Well, it's a religious service. It takes place within a Eucharistic service, and it signifies the descent of God's grace upon the monarch.
How does that fit then with the sense of abdication?
Which abdication, sorry?
How does it fit within the concept of abdication? I mean, some monarchies seem happier to abdicate than others.
Yes, that
British
is true.
British monarchy doesn't seem too keen on abdication.
Yes, that is true. And I alluded briefly to that somewhere early on. It is the case that monarchs in the Scandinavian countries and in the UK do not, on the whole, abdicate. In recent times, Edward VIII is the only example. And you'll notice that the monarchs in Denmark, Sweden and Norway do not abdicate. They stick it out until the last. And it's thought that that is related to the fact that they are required by law to be members of a particular Christian faith, and that they are therefore, in some personal sense, committed thereby to serve out the whole of their lives. In the other monarchies, this is not so, as you point out. Particularly in the Netherlands, the monarchs regularly retire when they reach their early 70s. And I used to think that was a sort of therapeutic form of abdication, because it meant that the heir was able to enjoy the early adult life without having to be the monarch. And they could marry and bring up their families and so on and so forth, and then take over at an age when they'd settled in adult life. But I don't think it's therapeutic in that sense at all. They just think in their 70s, they want to take off. And in Japan, of course, there's no way of dealing with this. You may remember that the emperor indicated that having attained the age of 83, he thought he'd be very grateful if he could retire. And there was a great hullabaloo about this in the Japanese parliament. And eventually a law had to be passed to permit this to happen. The Japanese succession is very tight at the moment because it doesn't recognize female descent. And there's only a very small group of people who are eligible to succeed. So they may have to turn to this again and also revisit the rule about female descent. The Salic law never applied in Britain. And of course, we have had queens way back accordingly.
Can I ask a delicate question? John O'Connor perhaps hinted at it earlier. It's on the religious issue. Given that the UK has become a much more secular society, multicultural, multi-religious, how long do you think that the Crown can hold on to the monarch having to be an absolute Protestant Church of England person?
Yes, well, I think that's a very good question. And I think it's most uncertain how we can continue in the present vein. And I think these issues will be exposed by the coronation when it happens, which may be some years ahead, of course. And it is true that we are both more secularized and we're more pluralized. I mean, religious difference is not just different Christian sects. I mean, it's different religions. And the size of the Islamic population is now nearly 5%. And this makes a very different kind of Britain. And it's not at all clear, for example, although the Prince of Wales has let it be known he'll swear his mother's oaths, it's not clear what Prince William thinks about all this and that generation. And they may, as you say, Peter, be very much anxious to ensure that somehow or other their reign does not mean that they are not there also for religions other than the Christian, or least of all the Anglican.
Thank you, Bob. Brian, you've raised your hand.
Thanks, Nick. Yes, hi, thanks, Bob. Very interesting. I'd like to ask a kind of follow-on question to what you were just saying. It is hypothetical because I think Charles is very keen to get his hands on the crown, but I'm not sure how popular a king he will be, for example, as a contrast to William. So my question is a constitutional one. If, and I know it's hypothetical, but if Charles decided he wanted to be bypassed and for William to take the crown immediately, would he, based on what you said about him being de facto king, would he have to formally abdicate before William could then become king?
Well, the law would have to be changed, yes. And the easiest way of doing that perhaps is just to alter the succession. Whether it would have to entail an abdication, it's moot perhaps for the lawyers, but there'd have to be a parliamentary act to allow it to happen. And I think the present position is that the prince, having been in waiting for so long, what government would want to take it away from him? What son would want it?
Yeah.
But it does mean that at the moment we are facing a fairly geriatric succession, because the Prince of Wales, Charles will himself be quite elderly. I mean, he's in his early 70s now. His mother, with luck, could live at least as long as her mother, probably longer. And that means that Charles would be even older than he is now. But not only Charles, I mean, William would be older too.
Yeah.
And we could be looking, I mean, he's in his, what is he now? He's 42, something like that. He's going to be getting on himself. And that might make jumping generations attractive on the one hand. On the other, I think unless Prince Charles volunteered to do this, I don't think anybody would wish to force it upon him.
Thank you.
That has been a really interesting conversation, Bob. So thank you so much for that. Hopefully I'm not cutting off anybody else. One last chance for questions. No. I will stop the recording here. But just to say again, thank you so much. That was very, very interesting and a really useful contribution to the talk series as well, I think.